Hello everybody, and welcome to today's Gardens Trust webinar by our Conservation Officer Margie Hoffnung, who many of you will be really familiar with. Margie's going to take you step by step through the process of responding to planning applications affecting historic parks and gardens, and hopefully show you that this is something that anyone can do. I'm Tamsin McMillan, I work for the Gardens Trust capacity building team, and I'm your host today along with my colleague Lyndon Groves. Our webinars have been developed to support the County Gardens Trust, but we're delighted to be joined today by a few people from other organisations as well, and you're all very welcome. Please do keep your cameras switched on if you'd like to. It's lovely to see you. We are recording the session, so if you don't want your image recorded, just switch your camera off, please. So I'm just going to mute.
I'm just starting a planning webinar with Gardens Trust. Can I ring you later?
I'll just, if somebody's not muted, would they mind just muting themselves? Thank you. So if we suffer a break in the internet and we lose you, or you get sort of thrown out of the meeting, please do just use the original link. You should be able to get straight back in. If possible, could you make sure your correct name is showing? Sometimes people just sort of turn up labeled iPad and things like that. So it would be really useful for everybody in the meeting if you could just hover over click on the three little dots in the top right corner of the box that shows your image, and there's a rename option in there. If you wouldn't mind putting your full name and your County Gardens Trust or other organisation, that'd be really helpful. Thank you. So we are asking you to remain on mute through the presentation, but don't worry, you will be able to ask Margie questions, but we just ask if you could type these into the chat box instead of saying them, and Lyndon and I will read them out. Margie's presentation is in two halves, and there'll be a short break in the middle, so we'll take questions through each one, and we'll go through the questions at the end of each half. So you can get to the chat box if you don't already know by clicking on the little speech bubble symbol at the bottom of your screen and just typing your comment or your question in there. So I think that covers all the housekeeping. And I think nearly everybody is in, so I'm really pleased to hand over to Margie. Thank you very much.
So this is a bit of a double whammy, and I hope you won't all fall asleep before the end, but I can admire your stamina. So added to the joys of today, although I have done a variant of this before, it's always been to a live audience. And of course, beforehand, we were able to give you handouts which had all the planning documents on it, so you could read them and understand better what I'm talking about. I suppose we could have emailed them to you, but really, I don't think any of you want to print out pages and pages of paper. So I've had to rather play around with how I've gone through this. And I hope that I've managed to get the sort of vital points onto the slides, but possibly there are a few more slides than I might normally have done. So I hope that it will give you an idea of how to approach an unfamiliar planning application. So the example I'm using is several years old, and I did think that perhaps we should update it. But in the end, actually, I decided not to, because I haven't ever been able to find a better one, which, when you look at the initial description of the planning application, it actually sounds really quite a good idea. And it's only when you dig into it a bit deeper that you find perhaps it's slightly more nuanced, and maybe it's more complicated than it might seem at first stretch. And I think there's also the advantage that it's long enough ago so that if any of you either know the applicants or live nearby, there are no awkward, maybe local connections, and it can't be controversial because, of course, the outcome was decided a long time ago. So, and I know, having seen your names popping up at the beginning, that some of you are incredibly experienced at assessing a planning application and writing responses. So I feel that probably you could be teaching me a thing or two, but there is quite a wide range of experience. So I hope you'll bear with me, because I am going to go into all the stages in really quite some detail. And the first thing I want to say is that everybody does this slightly differently. So as long as you cover all the basics, it doesn't really matter how you go about it. What I hope I'll do today is to demystify the process and just make it seem a bit less daunting. And remember, I suppose, that at the end of the day, it's pretty much common sense. And I know you've all got masses of that. And again, we're not trying to run the country here or sort out Brexit. So if you find that it all gets a bit much when you're doing a planning application for real, you could go and put the kettle on, make a cup of tea, or maybe even have something a bit stronger. And if when you're doing it for real, you find that actually you're getting stuck or a bit confused, you can always email us or maybe get in touch with someone else in your CGT, because sometimes a second pair of eyes is really helpful. So the next 3 slides I'm going to show you is going to give you an overview of the different stages. And after that, I'm going to go through those one by one in much more detail. Oops, sorry. Okay. What I want to stress from the start is that obviously the applicant is going to be keen as mustard to present their application in the most favourable light. So it is possible that they might maybe gloss over a few things that are slightly less favourable. And so just keep that in the back of your mind as you're reading through things. Now, not all applicants are by any means unscrupulous developers, and I'm not suggesting that for any moment, but just keep it in the back of your mind that it's worth being the teensiest bit sceptical when you read the online documentation, and be aware of what perhaps they omitted to mention. When you become more familiar with the planning process, you will also see that some of the online documents are going to be a lot more helpful than others. And I think you'll soon discover for yourself what kind of ones they are. This is not a housing application. And often when you get one with, a huge housing development, there might be 300 documents. And some of them, really you probably don't need to bother with, especially if it's like the layout of, the style X of whatever house it is. So in an ideal world, when you get your planning application, you would go and visit the site if at all possible. But obviously with COVID, that's even more difficult. And even in normal times, sometimes it's just not possible. And certainly for me, it's this bit of it that I so value the input of the various CGTs around the country, because that you are my eyes and ears on the ground. But today we're actually going to attempt this blind without a site visit. And so it's a bit more realistic. And also I have never visited this site myself. So I just thought you should know that too. Now, as a statutory consultee, we have no automatic right to be allowed to visit a site. But I think you can always ask nicely and hope for the best. But often you do have to be content with looking at the application site, maybe from a public road or a footpath. And don't forget that Google Maps and Google Earth are also really helpful tools. So for me, certainly one of the first things I do is I take time to understand exactly where the application site is in relation to the registered park and garden that it might affect. And occasionally I'm going to refer to that as an RPG. So in your mind's eye, even as you're familiarising yourself with the application, just start thinking of views and whether the proposal might be visible from any part of the RPG, both in winter and in summer, or whether you can see it from footpaths or roads, or indeed from other heritage sites in the vicinity. So make a mental note if it lies within a conservation area or an area of outstanding natural beauty, an AONB. Or in this case, as you'll see, whether it affects maybe a scheduled ancient monument. Now, the last general point that I want to make before we look in detail at the application is that when you have read through everything and you have visualized the site from every possible direction, I imagine that you're going to have in your mind formalized some kind of idea as to whether or not you approve of this application, or whether you feel that maybe with a few tweaks it could be okay, or that it's a horror to be strongly objected to. So the thing that is really important at this point is to find things that can back up your stance. It's not nearly so daunting as it might sound when words like the NPPF or the National Planning Policy Framework are bandied around. We're going to look at those in more detail, not in this talk, but in the next talk. And once you realise that actually these documents are fairly straightforward, it's just a matter of plucking out useful paragraphs that you can use to support your stance and quote them when you write your letter. I've actually got a little sort of file on my desktop, which is called useful paragraphs. And I tend to put things from the NPPF or the local plan or whatever into that, so that I can just go in there and pluck them out, and I don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. And it certainly saves me hours of time. So we haven't even looked at the application. So let's make a start at looking at the documents. Now, I really am going back to basics here. So the first thing you have to do is to get onto the local planning authority's planning website. Now, rather than just put in Chichester Council, I put in into Google, I put in Chichester Council planning or whatever your local authority is, because that avoids me having to wade through things like saying when the library's open and when bin collection days are, that kind of stuff. So lo and behold, up comes a screen pretty like this. And I mean, there are various ways you can get to it, but I will just say comment or search on planning application. So you click that, and then something like this will come up. Now, very conveniently, on Chichester District Council, there's a very obvious box that says view planning applications. And if it's another local authority, there'll be a very similar screen. They don't change that much. So we're going to be clicking on that, and then you will get something along these lines. Sometimes most local authorities have exactly this page. A few of them have a slightly different system, but by and large, I think you'll work your way through that. And you can see that at the bottom of this, there is a sort of box where it says that you have to enter a keyword, a reference number, postcode, or the address. So I have entered the planning application number into that. And you just need to click on that, click on search, and now we're in business. So this will be the initial screen that comes up once you've got into the planning website. And you will see that there is, you don't need to look, but there is the description of the application. And then here, there are lots of useful little tabs, all of which have different things that you're going to be using. Now, certainly for me, the most important thing is to know how long you've got to respond to this application. It's complicated slightly for the Gardens Trust, because although we keep telling local authorities to send things by emails, can you believe it? Still, even during COVID, quite a few of them still send things by post to our London office, which even in the best of times is only manned part-time. So the date is pretty crucial. So you can find that here under the thing that says important dates. Now, if when you click on that, you find to your horror that you've actually got a very short turnaround time, and maybe it's quite a complicated thing, you can always ask nicely for a bit of an extension. And I find that the case officers are generally pretty amenable if you ask them nicely. Now you can see there are lots of other little tabs with words like documents. That's a very important one. And the other thing you've got here, you've got, map. And you want to find out who the case officer is, because I will always send stuff to the case officer if I can. Now, you would have thought that that would have been under contacts, but of course it isn't. It's under further information. So the vital button that we need in this instance is the one that says documents. But in case you couldn't read in that tiny print what the application actually is, here it is. So let's read through it together. I've got so many pictures of me on the side here, I can't read what it says. Okay, right. It says that it's a proposed development of a new model farm on existing agricultural land. Well, that sounds okay, doesn't it? Next bit, slightly more concerning. There's a new building on site, a toilet block, which seems quite big. But of course, if they've got a model farm, they are going to need some loos. So that seems reasonable. Then it goes on to say that they want to construct footpaths as per plans constructed of local stones. Okay, they're local stones. So that's, again, they've thought about it. And they are going to construct new boundary fencing for the paddocks for this farm to match existing. So that's fine. Then they say that they need to change the use for the new proposed picnic area from its existing use as farmland to a new use as an area for public to use as a picnic area. Well, you know, it's probably, you know, grassland, And so if they pop a few picnic benches and things on there and maybe the odd table, that doesn't sound too bad. So I think that's a nice friendly touch. So let's go into the documents to find out more details. So these are not all the documents that come up for this particular application, but I think it's a good indication of the sort of stuff that you're going to be using. As I said, you're going to quickly find out which the key ones are. But for me, the key thing is to find out where this development is in relation to the registered park and garden. I think you can see that there are several things. Location plan, that sounds good. There's some more location plans and site plans. So these would be the first places that I would look to try to work out where they are. So if you click on all of those, really irritatingly in this instance, absolutely none of them is any use whatsoever. You're just going to have to take my word for it. So there's nothing in this that tells me how the site relates to the wider area of Cowdray Park, Registered Park and Garden. And also on the description of the application, there is no postcode. So that's really irritating. So you can't look it up on Google Maps. So what should you do next? So we'll go back here to this application summary. And you may notice that here there's this little tag that says map. So let's click on that and see what comes up. Ah, terrific. So now I hope you can make out that this is the application site, which is outlined in a dark green. But this is also a very useful map because this is going to be able to give you some idea of the layout of the land around it. You can see that to the north of it is a main road, which in fact is the A272. And above it, here there's a golf course. And you can see that if you look at all the contours, it's clear that the land is sloping down quite steeply up at the top and less steeply as we get down through the whole site and down to here, where you can see this is obviously clearly, a scheduled ancient monument, Cowdray Ruins. And you can also see that there doesn't appear to be much in between the application site and the ruins. And you can see off to the right here, sorry, you can see that there are woodlands. And on the other side, there's a town. So I hope that you are getting a feel for where this application is lying within the landscape. But since nothing was very helpful on the documents online, this is where I would probably go and I would look on Google Maps and you can get an aerial view. Now, if you want to orientate yourself again, you can see that here is that main road, the A272. This is the golf club. You can see all the different greens and the bits and pieces there. And there's a very wide open space between the application site and the ruins. This area we're going to find out is the polo field, but this is all farmland, which as you can see has actually been ploughed. So we're going to now compare this to one of the online site drawings. And you can see that actually very conveniently, it matches pretty much exactly the shape that they ploughed. So this is what they want to do. This is an important document. What you want to look at is how this is divided up. And you can see that what had been open field has now been divided by a lot of paths, which are the different rotational blocks. And you need to start thinking as to whether this will sit unobtrusively within the whole landscape. Is it going to be visible? Is it going to be discrete? And remember that the area is on a slope. And it's a very different set of arrangement of the land to what is already there. So let's just have a look at that here. I'm comparing it to that aerial photograph. And what you should probably notice is that here is a good thing to sort of locate yourself. We've got this pond in the middle of both of them. So now what we need to find out is how this site relates to the RPG. So we need to go onto Historic England's website. I am really going back to basics here. And so obviously you type in Historic England and you will come to a thing that says search the list. And on this, you type in Cowdray Park in the search box. And when you click on that, there are actually 10 different entries for Cowdray on Historic England. But for brevity, I am just taking the two which are most directly relevant. So I'm not going to look at individually listed buildings. So you can see that the Cowdrey House Park and Garden is a grade 2-star RPG, and that the medieval house and the ruins are a scheduled ancient monument. Now I want to see where these are, what the registered land looks like. So I'm going to go here. You can see this is on the Historic England register entry. This is the map which shows the whole RPG. Now it's a little bit difficult to get your bearings here, but this is useful. This is the road that goes through in the middle of the site. And you can see that this is our area for the proposal, which lies bang smack in the middle of the RPG. So if I was doing this live, this is the point where I'd say, well, you should now probably look at the Historic England register entry, and also for the ruins. And I would show you that you would have the design and access statement, and you could just spend a bit of time familiarizing yourself with what's what. But, you know, this is where we start to think all the time, is this going to show up? Is it going to have a negative or a positive effect on the registered park or garden? So at this point, let's go back to that list of documents. The kind of things that I would find useful to look at is I would be interested to see what English Heritage said about it. You can see that the Parish Council had words to say about it. The Sussex Gardens Trust responded. There's the South Downs. So all these things are helpful, and you will get some kind of feel for what the local stakeholders are thinking about this application. What I can't see on here, and what I would like to have seen, and you're going to have to take my word that it's not on the next page, is a visual impact assessment, which is exactly what it sounds like. It would be perhaps with photos or photo montages to show what effect the proposals might have on different areas of the registered park and garden, specific viewpoints. Now, also, if the local planning authority has a conservation officer, they may well have visited the site before the application was put in and validated. So it's worth looking through to see if there's a comment from them. So these are the kind of things that you're going to be looking for. In this instance, there is no comment from a planning officer. And the only thing we've really got to look at, which might be promising, there's a site history report, whereas there's a design and access statement. Okay, now we're going to go through these online documents. We're going to look first at the design and access statement. Now, I'm afraid I can't give this to you in person. And I thought if I scanned it, you know, you're going to fall asleep in a second with pages and pages of close type. So you're going to have to just trust that I'm going to be picking out the salient points on the next few slides. The first thing is that it tells you exactly where the site is. It says that it's bounded on the north by the A272 and the golf club, and to the south by the Cowdrey Park polo ground and the ruins site, and so forth. It does mention that it's within the South Downs AONB. So far, there's no mention of the historic landscape. It says that it's owned by the Cowdrey estate and that they want to form an educational hub as a learning centre destination, which, you know, is a really worthy aim, I'd say. They want to connect people to farming, nature and the landscape. And obviously they have an economic necessity to make enough income for it to wash its face. So that to me seems perfectly reasonable. And it also says that the Cowdrey estate consulted and met with the local community and local stakeholders, which included parish councillors, and that in general they received very positive feedback and that no one voiced any real objection against the principle of the idea. Well, I think we could agree that the principle is quite a nice thing. So it goes on to say that the farmland use in this area is not going to change, but the project will establish a small-scale, sustainable agricultural rotation, which encompasses both crops and livestock. So in that, there is nothing to me that would immediately ring alarm bells, except that when they say that everybody locally thought it was a great idea, I might perhaps be slightly wary, but there you go. So let's go on to the design principles. the DNA goes on to explain that the only changes to the site are going to be the formation of these new footpaths with the fencing, which is going to be a boundary for each of these little new paddocks. And the picnic area is new, and there's going to be a new loo block. But they do stress that the new fencing and the footpaths are going to match the ones that are already there. So they say that this will avoid a noticeable impact on the features of the local area, and that they say that the overall impact on the area will be minimal. So of course, you know, they're presenting this in a very positive light, and so far we haven't seen anything which might tell us that this may not be the case. So we now need to go on, and we are going to read about its effect on the landscape. Finally, here we have our first mention of historic parkland. They say that the proposals have been planned specifically so they don't have a detrimental impact on the general landscape value of the AONB or the adjacent historic parkland. Now note, they say adjacent historic parkland. There's nothing to say that it lies within a registered park or garden, what grade that registered park might be, and there's no other mention of any other heritage assets whatsoever. It also says that the access is going to remain the same. So that's pretty much what we've got there. So here, finally, they get down to the nitty-gritty, and they start to tell us about the size of the pathways. And if you cast your mind back to the layout plan, which you've got here, there are an awful lot of pathways. And if each path is going to be 3.2 meters wide, that's about 10.5 feet. And each path on either side is going to have new fencing. Suddenly, I think that when they say that it's not really going to change very much apart from the new loos, I think that this may not be entirely the case. You've got to remind yourself that at the moment, this is an entirely open field. And so as far as the DNA is concerned, that's it. So clearly, when we've read this, you are supposed to come away with the impression that this is an extremely worthy project. It's educational, that the new layout uses local materials, and it makes minimum impact upon the site. So before we decide whether or not we agree with the applicants, we need to look at the other supply documents before we contrast them to what we know about the site. So firstly, this is the drawing which shows us what the pathway and the fence is going to look like. There is the path at the bottom, and it's a stone construction, and they're going to be in a sort of spider's web around the central pond area. So at this point, the warning antenna are just beginning to twitch a bit. At the top, you have got the new fencing. This is pretty standard sheep fencing. And if this was just going to go around the boundary of perhaps the entire site, I don't think I'd mind quite as much. But if you think that that's going to be on either side of each of those wide new paths, I think it's going to entirely change the feel of the area. So I'm going to look now at the drawing which shows the top bit of the site, the northern bit of the site. The paddocks are all down in this area, and this is a scout hut which is already there. It's not going to move, it's not going to change, it's going to remain the scout hut. But below it, there are some outbuildings, and these are going to be livestock buildings. So that doesn't change. This is where the loo is, and it's within an existing copse. So I don't think that will give me much cause to worry. I mean, I think it looks pretty well screened. This is the menage. Now, they say that the menage was used as overflow parking for things. But let's look a bit more closely at the loo. Okay, so it's made of horizontal timber battens, and it's got a clay tiled roof. And this chimes exactly with the local vernacular. So personally, I've got no problem with that. And as it's probably quite well screened by the trees, I think that is still okay. So now I hope that you're kind of familiar with what's proposed. So what we need to do is look in much more detail as to how this site sits within the landscape. And this is where some of the photos that are contained with the site history report come in useful. Okay, this is the first one. This little arrow shows the direction that we're looking at. And here is the menage looking pretty, I don't know, it looks pretty messy really. But what can you see in the background? Down here, that is the ruins, isn't it? So if this area was suddenly resurfaced and full of parked cars, would you be able to see it from the ruins? And would this have a detrimental impact? I think that probably the answer for both those questions is undoubtedly yes. So I'm now thinking, oh dear, and that, by the way, is the little copse where the loo block's going to be. So it is quite thick. And even in the winter, I think if that was tucked in the wood, that probably wouldn't be an issue. So there's another photograph here. This is another one looking south. This is looking over where the picnic area is. This is looking, it's rather overgrazed, but again, we can see there are the ruins, aren't there? And right at the back, you can see the South Downs in the background. So bear in mind that this rough ground that you can see in the foreground is going to be crisscrossed with this spider web of new paths and fencing. Are they going to be visible from the ruins? Yes, I think they are. So we need to understand how important the ruins are and this particular area is in relation to the whole Register Park and Gardens. So it's time to look more closely at the Historic England Register. We've already ascertained that it's right in the middle of the Registered Park and Garden. So we're going to look at it now in relation to the ruins here. This is the site, the outline of the site. And here is our planning application area with that little pond in the middle. Again, I think you can see there is pretty much nothing in between. We've got the polo field, which admittedly is quite well manicured and mowed, but it is still grass. So I think that it's not going to be, it hasn't completely spoiled the whole area. So let's go in a little more detail here. And this is the time where we read the description of Cowdray House. Now, if we were live, I again would have given you the handout. So if you read that, is there anything on there that immediately springs out to you which hasn't been mentioned? Well, to me, there is Lancelot Brown. He wasn't just probably the most important of all the landscape, the landscape designers, but I don't remember hearing anything about him in the DNA. Or indeed that Cowdray House itself has a grade 2 designation. So forgive me if I labour the point, but let's just recap what the DNA does actually mention. It says that it lies within the South Downs AONB. It says that the current use is arable farmland and that the site is going to become a learning centre destination. They said that local consultation didn't result in any real objections, site is going to remain in agricultural use, and that actually they're going to improve and alter the layout with these new smaller fields and paddocks. And they say that the appearance of the site is only going to change slightly and that there will be no effect on the AONB or the adjacent parkland. So it doesn't say anything about registered park or garden. And it also says that the loo block won't make much impact and that the scale of the works is minimal. And in case you were worried that no trees are going to be affected and that they're going to refurbish the menage. But to my mind, there is a lot missing. So let's have a look at what is missing. Okay. Despite their assurances to the contrary, there is quite a lot that I think they omitted to mention. There is absolutely no mention whatsoever about the grade 2 star Register Park Garden, the grade 1 listed building, which are the ruins, which also has scheduled ancient monument status. There is no mention of Capability Brown. There's nothing at all about setting, significance, or views. You can read the list for yourself. Crucially, they don't mention the views and they just have a bland assurance that the changes are going to avoid noticeable impact upon the feature of the local area. And I would have liked to have seen some kind of document with map regressions and maybe photographs taken from sensitive parts of the registered park and garden to show whether this new proposal will be visible from there. So, do you agree that this is going to have very little impact? I can't say that I do. And to me, that also indicates that the quality of the design and access statement is pretty poor. I think it's very inadequate, and I find it extraordinary that it should fail to have mentioned all these really important things. So as none of the documents that we have online help us really on settings or views, it's a useful thing to know that Google Earth quite often has what they call photo points of major views. So I thought it might be worth checking to see if they actually have one for Cowdray. And yes, they do. Bingo! A terrific shot taken from pretty much where our proposed model farm is going to be. And this is clearly considered a major view by Google because you've got a nice view of the ruins and in the background, the South Downs. So I don't think that there can be any doubt in our minds that if we can see the ruins clearly, the proposal is going to be pretty visible looking back from the Scheduled Ancient Monument upwards across the registered park and garden. So I, for one, by this stage, am beginning to have serious qualms about this application, despite the initial description sounding really quite innocent and even positive, might I say. So we need to now boil down what might be significant about the site before we write our response. If you were looking at an application which had very few details, which is not the case here, you should make sure that you remember that you've got to focus any of the points that you make solely on the factors which you feel might affect the registered park and garden. So it means you can ignore things like traffic or access issues, wildlife, flooding, housing provision, all the things that in many planning applications you find local residents write in to complain about. I would only possibly start to talk about some of those if I'm really grasping at straws, but we're not, I don't think, here. So some of you may well have tuned in to hear Lyndon's really excellent presentation on significance very recently. So I'm not going to go over that in great detail, but we do need to understand Cowdray's significance in order to assess it against the proposal and to articulate it within our response letter. So we are going to be thinking of the site as a whole ensemble of factors, and we need to decide for ourselves what makes it important enough to be listed at grade 2 star. So we need to be thinking about what impact the topography might have, who was involved in the creation of the site, and whether a lot of it survives. We need to know what the particular part of the parkland that our model farm is going to be on, how important that is towards the significance of the parkland. So again, if this was a live presentation, you would be able to look back through the register entry and go and pick out salient facts. So today, I'm afraid you're going to have to bear with me again and allow me to summarise most of the major factors which I think contribute to its significance. I've pinched Lyndon's slide here just to remind you of what the different criteria are used by the National Planning Policy Framework. And of course, to remind you that, again, not every aspect of the site needs necessarily be significant. So we're going to use these things here to draw up a pretty basic statement of significance for Cowdray. Okay. As far as the Cowdray RPG is concerned, very roughly speaking, if we break them down into categories, I think the archaeological aspect relates to the potential of a place to reveal new information. We need to know what unrealised archaeological or archive potential this place might have. Here we know we've got the ruins and the archaeology of a 15th century mansion, which may well reveal in future more about medieval fortified houses. There are actually very good archives for Cowdray, and amazingly, the Brown account books survive. So we've got a lot that we can be taking. And added to this, there are some wonderful watercolours by the amazingly named Samuel Hieronymus Grimm, which I'm going to share with you in a moment. So all of this taken together, coupled with site assessments in the future, may well give historians an opportunity to learn more about this, both the Register Park and Garden and the Schedule Ancient Monument. So if we then turn to the aesthetics of it, we could see for ourselves how the open parkland had panoramic views down to the South Downs, which from the map we know are framed by wooded slopes, and they are remarkably unchanged from when they were first conceived. And this open aspect contrasts with the 19th century formal and woodland gardens around Cowdray, which are given dramatic focus by those ruins. So finally, we look at the historic aspect, which lies in the potential of the site to tell us stories about the past or to evoke a sense of what it might have been like to live here in the past. It's a kind of key to unlock a narrative which demonstrates Capability Brown's work and the way in which medieval buildings were sometimes incorporated as ornamental features in an open parkland. So looking at that, the only one that I don't think has much to say is the common one. So we need to sum this up in a statement of significance. And I'm going to read through this. Everyone does this differently, and if you wrote it, it might come out slightly different. But for the purposes of today, I'm going to say that the site's significance lies chiefly in the way in which the Capability Brown parkland uses a blend of openness, views, and tree plantings to create an archetypical 18th century landscape, which is still clearly visible and readable today. The ruins of the fortified medieval Grade 1 Cowdray House are a major feature, which provides a dramatic eye catcher across the design landscapes, with the South Downs forming an extensive distant backdrop. Okay, so now we have our statement of significance, and we need to have a look at what they want to do and contrast it to the sort of important things about the park. So I think this slide will encapsulate the hoped for outcome versus the important things that we need to consider. Now, there is one final thing that I want to look up, which is taken from the Historic England entry. And once I show it to you, I hope that you're going to agree that it clearly demonstrates that these long views have always, down to the ruins, been considered pretty important. You're going to have to take my word for it, but at the end of the Historic England register entry, there is a section that's called References. In that, it mentions that there are illustrations by S.H. Grimm called Views of Cowdray. So if you happen to Google those to see if anything useful comes up, this doesn't always work, by the way, but in this instance, I'm glad to say that it did. And there were some brilliant illustrations, which I think you're going to agree are very helpful to our cause. So let's have a look at a couple of them now. This is the first one. When you Google Cowdray and Grimm and you choose images, this is the first thing that comes up. And you can see that it's an 18th century watercolour, and it's taken from pretty much exactly where our application site is now. And you can see the open nature of the parkland and the castle down at the bottom, and in the background are the South Downs. And just to reinforce the fact that this was always considered an important view, you can see this little man here in the front. Actually, he's even pointing as if to say, look, isn't this an amazing view? So it was considered important then, and it's clearly recognisable today. So was there any mention of this in the DNA? No, there was not. So let's look at the next picture. There we go. You probably can't make it out, but this slide is actually dated 1781. This is the second of the Grimm illustrations. And although this doesn't show the application site, when you're looking at this, you are standing in the place that Grimm would have been when he was painting this view. And what you need to think about is whether he would have been able to see the application site from where he was standing. And I think almost certainly he would have, because it's kind of up here. So by seeing these two contemporary illustrations, I think this adds to our knowledge of the site, and it gives us a contemporary glimpse as to realizing that these views were always considered important. So when you think about the omissions that I've already discussed with you, plus this contemporary evidence, I think it's pretty clear that the planning site has always been part of the extensive views so much admired over 200 years ago and still considered an important viewpoint from today. So if you take all that into consideration, do you agree that the proposals will cause harm to the setting and significance of the RPG? I'm afraid that I think that they do. Now we are almost there now, you'll be glad to hear. So before we go on to the next stage of writing our response, we have to be really clear about what we're going to object to. But also, you have to think if there's anything in this that you might think is a good idea or that you can support. Or is there anything that you might suggest to mitigate the harm should the planners decide to approve it? Or is it just so awful that there's nothing that can lessen the impact? So I'm going to try and summarize this in the next slide. Okay, so we have quite a few things that we object to. This new area of development very much breaks into the broad sweep of the parkland. It is definitely a visual intrusion, I think, not just on the ruins and the scheduled ancient monument across a key vista. There's nothing which reminds us of the historic significance of the site. It affects the setting of the registered park and garden. Altogether, I think it's not a great thing. So you're probably all as exhausted as I am, but let's see if there's anything that we can be positive about. Okay, good. They're going to make the pond better. So that's nice. So in mitigation, we need to say, is there a conservation management plan? Well, if there is, they certainly didn't tell us about it. So that's something to bear in mind and perhaps to mention. There's also nothing to say whether they looked at other bits of their estate to put this model farm elsewhere. So, you know, maybe they should have thought about this. And equally, could you screen the parking on the manage? I think if they did do that, it probably wouldn't work because the whole point of this area is that it's very open. So to screen it off with more woodland is not necessarily a good idea. And if they grassed the paths instead of having them with stone, would that help? Yeah, it probably would a bit. So let's go on to this. You have got to remember that when you write your response, you've got to be absolutely clear. You've got to be polite. You can't be too long and waffly. You've got to make sure you get your planning response in time. And you're going to need to refer to the local plan and the National Planning Policy Framework. And you have to very specifically just talk about the points that actually might affect this. Now, when I'm doing this normally, I would probably now start to talk about the local plan and the NPPF. But to be honest, I think that that's just too much for now. You've already sat through a great deal. So we're going to leave talking about those and also Historic England's setting of heritage assets to a bit later. So I'm going to leave you with a few final thoughts. Okay. Even if you are seething with fury, don't forget that you just got to be polite. And what we would really, really like is that you copy us in to any response that you might make. Of course, anything you do write, you've got to be sure that it's 100% factually accurate, because should this go to appeal, you're going to have to remember that you may have to justify this response. And it is going to end up on the local authority's website, so anybody can read it. And the other thing that's perhaps worth remembering is that though some local authorities have incredibly knowledgeable planning officers, not each one of them has experience in historic designed landscapes. So you need to think of your letter as a way of helping them understand what's important about this site and helping them to come to a decision. So every sentence you write needs to support your position. And if it doesn't add to your argument, then you need to leave it out. The copy of your letter is going to go onto our conservation casework blog. And this is an incredibly invaluable response. And you're going to be delighted to hear that this is I'm coming to the very, very last slide in this presentation. So I wonder if you're curious to know what happened. Ta-da! They withdrew it. So thank you so much for listening. You've now got, maybe you've got some questions. And if you haven't, there's time to put the kettle on and go away and take a deep breath before we come back for the next part of this. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much, Margie. It's a marathon, isn't it? Getting through all the material that you need to look at. And that's what your day job is like every day. So in the questions box, we had a suggestion from Sally Stradling of Oxfordshire Gardens Trust.
Yep.
She said that you can ask for sufficient information to assess an application. So a map showing areas of greater and lesser significance to help inform impact could be helpful. And she's done this at some sites in Oxfordshire, which sort of prompts me to ask, do you frequently have to go back and ask for further information?
Yes, an awful lot. And actually, when we're going to be talking about writing the planning response, I'm going to talk about that a bit more. But sometimes it depends how angry I am about the application. If otherwise, it's not too bad. I often just write my response and say, you know, we'd like to find out a bit more about it. But sometimes we actually say this is a holding objection until the applicant can provide more information. In fact, even this morning, I've just sent off a second response. We got an application for a golf course, and it didn't say whether they wanted to put shipping containers in. And there was absolutely no mention of a registered park or garden or anything in the designer access statement, pretty similar to here. So it's impossible to tell whether the thing would be visible from within the registered park. So I wrote saying that, you know, in the absence of anything or a visual impact assessment, we weren't able to decide, because at the moment with COVID, it's very hard to go and do a site survey. So I got a very cross email back from, I suppose, the agent saying, you know, of course we are very aware of the site, but they didn't say. But I think that actually we wrote a perfectly reasonable thing. And at the weekend, one of the members of the Northumbria Gardens Trust was actually able to go and trudge through a few muddy fields. And he said, in fact, it's absolutely fine. So I did go back and say, you know, subsequent to my first letter, we've been able to assess it. And, you know, under the circumstances where we're withdrawing our holding objection. So I think, you know, you can, that's sort of how it works quite often.
Thank you. Right, so in the second half, Margie will be taking us through the actual letter response to this planning application. So why don't we take 10 minutes to just go and have a cup of tea, and if everybody could be back here by 25 to, please, that would be great. Thanks very much.
Okay, well done for surviving that first rather marathon thing about the planning application. So we discovered that despite looking pretty innocuous to start off with, it actually wasn't all it was cracked up to be. So now we are going to write a response letter, and it makes sense with that one fresh in our mind to use that application as our example. Now, again, this is a talk that I've only ever done live. And when we did this before, we had a kind of whiteboard and everyone could write, you know, could shout out their suggestions, and we could write them on the board. And so it was very much a kind of team effort. So it's a bit more difficult to do this when it's only me talking to you and not hearing what you're saying. But again, if you go away and you're trying to respond to some other application and you can't remember all the things that we've talked about, just don't worry about it, because this presentation is going to be on the Gardens Trust Resource Hub pretty quickly, and you can just go on it and remind yourself. The other good thing that you're going to find on there are some template response letters, both for responding to applications that affect a registered park or garden, or for ones for non-reg sites. So, you know, it's not too difficult. So let's get going. Okay. There are really 5 main components of the letter. And I think if you look at them, you can see they're pretty self-explanatory. The only one that we didn't cover in the previous talk was policy. And I'm going to go through that when we get to that bit of the letter. We call this writing a planning letter, but of course it's much more likely to be a planning email. So we don't need to really get tied up in the semantics of that. So if you're getting the details of the planning application off Alison's weekly casework log, wherever possible, she will give the email address of the planning authority to send this to. And sometimes you get the email address of the case officer. But if that's not available, I'm going to show you at the end how you can send this through the local authority's planning website. First thing I do is I always start my letter with the application number and the full description exactly as it appeared on the application documents. So we don't need to go through that, you know what that says. And then I have a pretty standard opening paragraph, which goes pretty much along the lines of what you're going to read on this screen here. So it says, thank you for consulting the Gardens Trust in its role as statutory consultee with regard to proposed development affecting a site listed by Historic England on their Register of Parks and Gardens as per the above application. The inclusion of this site on the National Register is a material consideration in the planning process. And then, especially if I'm doing this in conjunction with a County Gardens Trust, I add another sentence where we talk about, or the County Gardens Trust can talk about its relationship to the Gardens Trust. And the reason we have put this on there is that we were finding that County Gardens Trusts were all describing their relationship with the Gardens Trust in lots of different ways. Most of them were absolutely fine, but we became a little concerned that should a particular planning application go to appeal, it is just likely, and it would be sod's law, that it would be the one time when a County Gardens Trust perhaps used slightly inaccurate wording to describe their relationship, and it could actually cause the appeal to go in the wrong way. So we did approach, we've got a pro bono lawyer, planning lawyer, who we've used, and she put together this rather tedious sentence, which if you are writing on behalf of County Gardens Trust, we would be super grateful if you could actually use, simply because it avoids all possibility of there being problems in the future. And that really reads, the ex-Gardens Trust is a member organisation of the Gardens Trust, and it works in partnership with it in respect to the protection and conservation of registered sites. And here's the important bit, it's authorised by the Gardens Trust to respond on their behalf in respect of such consultations. So if you're doing this as an independent person, you'll be able to think of some appropriate wording, but you need to sort of say who you are. Now, there are, of course, some amazing Gardens Trusts who seem to be so efficient that they can also respond to non-registered sites. Now, I could talk about that, but I'm not going to confuse the issue. Suffice to say that if you want to know, there is a template letter on our website which has got the wording that you can use. So in the last talk, we put together our statement of significance. And so this is, after we've done the introductory paragraph, this is where we make use of it. Of course, planning authority staff are very busy people, and they can't be expected to know everything about every site they deal with. So we need to briefly encapsulate what really matters about Cowdray. We don't need to say every last detail, but just so they know why this is important. Also, the articulation of significance is required by the planning system. The NPPF requires applicants and those considering planning applications to assess whether the application affects the significance of a site rather than simply altering it physically. It's a way of ensuring that conservation is about managing change rather than just saying no to all change. And that this way we hope that helpful change can actually go ahead and that poor examples can be identified and perhaps stopped. Now, I'm going to talk more about the NPPF in a while, so just park any of those slightly nervous questions for the moment. If you cast your mind back to the previous talk, I'm pretty sure that the applicant did not cover sufficiently the points about significance. So admittedly, it was before the NPPF came into force, but the previous legislation did also have similar requirements. So we're now going to introduce our statement of significance, which we talked about, into the letter. Now, I'm sorry, there are a few of these slides that are quite wordy, but I couldn't think of a way of avoiding it. So without helpful whiteboards, I think we need to introduce the statement of significance by saying that you've looked at the online documentation, and if you have made a site visit, you can say that you've done so. And if you couldn't make it, you can say, if appropriate, that you have liaised with your colleagues who know the site and that their local knowledge informs your response. But equally, if that's simply not possible, you can blame COVID and say that you've had to make a desk-based assessment using the documents provided by the applicant and your own research. So you can word that first paragraph however you want, but you can get that kind of point across. Now, if you were going to do this in real life, you could probably, even with COVID, if you had the time, you could go and you could probably park at the golf club just above the thing, or maybe there's a lay-by on the main road, that sort of thing. But having got that in, and you say then, this is what significance is, we then can go on to the slightly more fun bit. This is where you can say in a pained but incredibly professional tone how surprised you were that the applicant failed to provide all the missing information that we've identified. So you can lay it on really thick. You can say that there's no mention of the grade 2-star RPG, there's no mention of the grade 1 ruins, scheduled ancient monument, nothing to do with, guess what, capability Brown, what a surprise. No mention of setting, significance, views, that, there was nothing about map progressions, there was nothing, we would have expected a heritage statement or probably a visual impact assessment. So, you are saying, really this is what the applicant should have provided. So having got that out of the way, we now are going to talk about the impact of this particular application on the Registered Park and Garden. This is going to form the bulk of your letter, and it's going to be quite a few paragraphs probably. So if you were struggling to perhaps make up your mind about what impact the proposal will make on the RPG, it could well be because the applicant hasn't given you enough information. So don't be afraid to ask for more information if you need it. Now, I think here this probably isn't the case because I think we've made up our own mind. But I do think that it is worth asking them to provide what you need. So if you do that, it's actually quite a nice delaying tactic, which can be helpful sometimes. But of course, when you are replying, always remember you must use a sort of nice impersonal and measured tone, even if you care really passionately about this particular site. And of course, it goes without saying, I suppose, that your opinions are going to be taken much more seriously if they are presented in a professional way. And again, always remember what your remit is. We are not there to talk about school provision. We are there to comment entirely on the aspects which might affect heritage assets. The proposal may well have lots of different impacts, and it could be on different parts of the site. So this is where you're going to be running through those impacts one by one. It's really important to stress the impact on setting. And I think at this point in a letter, I would probably say that there is nothing in the online documentation which helped us to ascertain whether the applicant had looked at maybe other sites within the estate, and if so, why they were rejected in favour of this particular site. So another thing that I'm going to mention now, even though it isn't particularly relevant here, it's more so that you're aware of it, is that if a site has been compromised by some kind of in some other development in the past, it's worth mentioning that perhaps this new thing will have a cumulative effect on the setting and significance. Another one that kind of comes into that category, which I want to draw your attention to, is say that instead of a model farm, this was an application for, say, a very smart new house. You would be able to say something along the lines of that if this is permitted, it is going to possibly set a precedent so that other, similar things may well come along in future. And in fact, just a couple of weeks ago, we had an application for a site in the Midlands where about a year and a half ago, I guess, someone applied to knock down a perfectly nice house on the edge of a Grade 2 registered park and build an enormous new one. And so we objected to it and said, if this is allowed, it will probably set a precedent. Of course, it was allowed, and lo and behold, along comes the next application for another huge house. So it was a case of kind of saying, I told you so. But remember, we are managing change, not just preventing it. It really isn't reasonable to object to absolutely everything that might affect a historic park or garden. We need to, as I keep saying, just concentrate on the impacts that have a harmful effect upon the setting and the significance of the site. So now we are going to be specific about the points that you're going to mention in your response for Cowdray. I'm going to spread out this impact over various slides so that you don't go completely cross-eyed. So I think we should begin with the fact that the application site lies entirely within the Grade 2 star RPG, and that this doesn't even get a mention on the online documentations. We should go on to say that the grim illustrations can prove really that the site has always been considered important as far as views are concerned, back as far as 1781. And the fact that today the Google Earth photo point shows that it's still considered a special view shows that this just hasn't changed. Even though 200 years have gone by, I think if you put in the link for the grim drawings, it gives a very immediate feeling for the views and the sense of place from 200 years ago. And it's absolutely obvious that the site is still recognizable from these drawings. And the 18th century character of the parkland, from when Capability Brown worked there from 1768 to 1774, remains readable today, even though astonishingly the documentation makes no mention that arguably the most famous English landscape designer worked here. Also, I think we would probably say that the poorly sited car park lies in a key view from the Grade 1 ruins or Scheduled Ancient Monument. Again, something that hasn't been mentioned in the documentation. So then we can move on to the effect on the land. And I think it's a very big change from that open farmland to a series of small rotational fields, which are divided, as we saw, by those wide pathways, a whole mass of new intrusive fencing. So that, I think, we should say, is going to compromise the open nature of the parkland. So if you combine that with the effect of the car park and the lots of new traffic and so forth, the picnic site, that all these are going to be alien and intrusive to the character of the designed Grade 2 star historic parkland, as well as the Grade 1 Scheduled Ancient Monument, which all lie in open parkland. I would also say that because of the topography, the model farm is going to be visible from every direction. Don't forget that the golf course is still within the registered park and garden, so you can see it from there because you look down on it, and from the bottom you will look up at it. So I think you need to perhaps put in one nice thing, because they're not to seem too damning. I think you could probably say that the loo building is likely to be reasonably well hidden, and we appreciate that the applicant has taken care to match the local vernacular. Okay, so we've said one nice thing at least. I do also make a point, which Sally picked up earlier. I do mention to case officers that without these vital documents which we listed, it really is very difficult to make a reasoned judgment as to the effect of the proposal upon a registered park or garden. Of course, we have privately decided, having looked at all these things, that actually this is a pretty poor application. But by suggesting that the applicants need to provide the missing documents, it not only buys us some time, but I think it also points out to the case officer that actually this is an important site, and that in order to make a sensible decision, it's really important that we have all the facts. Now, of course, you're going to be making all these points in your own words, and I guess it's going to probably take 3 or 4 paragraphs at least to make it crystal clear why we think that this is a poor application. Now, I do appreciate that these slides are pretty turgid and hard work. So before we come to the policy bit, which I'm sure you've all been looking forward to, I thought you might appreciate a little breather. This is a rather lovely watercolour of the west view of the ruins of Cowdray House, and it's by a chap called John Buckler, and it's dated 1825. When we are one day allowed to travel again, if you wish to go and see this in person, you can find it at the Yale Centre for British Art in America. So, time to take a deep breath, and we are going to plunge on and talk about the NPPF. Now, it is quite hard to make talking about policy feel vibrant and interesting, but I'm afraid we do need to persevere, because it's an incredibly useful tool in your kit bag when you are writing a letter of objection to a planning application. Now, don't be alarmed by this incredibly tedious slide. Actually, the main thing is that you need to get this link. Now, if you don't need to write it down now, because it's going to be on our website, or you could just put in National Planning Policy Framework in Google and you can get it. Planning officers are going to be completely familiar with this, so you don't need to quote the whole paragraphs in full. It's sufficient to give the relevant paragraph number and maybe a very brief précis of the content to explain how it's relevant to the point you wish to make. But for us, the bit that we particularly want is chapter 16, which you'll be glad to hear is actually not very long. And on this slide, you can see the paragraphs which I think are the most generally useful. But again, what I do is I have this on my useful paragraphs little file so that I can just nip in and get them whenever I want. So let's look first at 2 paragraphs which I think would be very appropriate here. In this letter, I would probably say that the applicant has failed to comply with paragraph 189, as they have not described either the significance of the relevant historic assets or made any comments as to the impact of their proposals on the significance. So this is particularly crucial given that the heritage assets are of national importance. You know, you stress this all the time. It's a grade 2 starred registered park or garden, and the scheduled ancient monument contains a grade 1 building. So the second paragraph, 190, deals with the development in the setting of a heritage asset, which I think also is undoubtedly of relevance here. Now, the next 2 paragraphs I'm mentioning not because I think they're going to be useful for this particular application, but I am going to put them in because I think you need to know about them, because you can use them to support your stance when replying to other applications. If you wanted, for example, you were going to quote paragraph 196 here, I think that the applicant would certainly argue that if they allowed to have their model farm, it is a public benefit. So I would avoid quoting that. But it is useful. You remember I mentioned that maybe someone wanted to put in a smart house here. Well, of course, that would have no obvious public benefit. So that's the sort of time when you'd use it. And if you they had said there was public benefit, that they would agree that if you quoted paragraph 194, if you provide the educational facility, they had certainly justified the proposal as per paragraph 194. So Now, although in this instance we are relating entirely to responding to the Cowdrey application, which is registered, of course, the MPPF does also cover policy for non-registered sites. Now, your CGT may well be so amazingly organised that they have time to respond to these kind of sites, but I'm not going to get sidetracked into talking about that, but just to make you aware that actually if you go into the MPPF yourself, in that chapter you will find lots of useful paragraphs which you can pluck out. The other thing, of course, is that we have got a template letter for non-registered site on our resource hub, so you can find it that way as well. Now, the local plan, of course, is crucially important. It's the blueprint for what the local authority has set out with regards to development in their area. What you need to do is to look for the section in this quite long document which deals with the historic environment. Now, of course, in the way of these things, pretty much every local authority calls it something slightly different, but if you look for anything that's called things like heritage or historic, you'll probably find it in the end. Now, for Chichester, it's under heritage and design. Sometimes, as a sort of little side note, it's worth perhaps looking in the tourism section where you can find a few useful things. So what you need to do is go to that section that deals with heritage and look through it, and you pull out relevant policies or paragraphs which support your arguments. And crucially, if the application contravenes any of these are wonderful things that you can pick out and put in your letter. And again, you're going to need to quote the paragraph numbers rather than writing it out in full. Now, national planning policy framework and national planning policy in general overrides all local things. So if your local authority doesn't have an adopted local plan, you just use the MPPF. But the local plan has to comply anyway with national policy, so they're very much interrelated. So now you need to brace yourself, because we are going to go into the Chichester local plan and we are going to see if we can find any specific policies which will support our argument. It turns out that Chichester's local plan, policy 47, heritage and design, this is the bit that we need to look at. And if we're looking at it closely, I think that there are several useful things that we can pull out. Again, I'm sorry, this is a rather text-heavy slide, but I've put them in full so that you get an idea of how it's laid out on the page. The bold text is my emphasis, it's not in the local plan. So as you can see here, policy 47.1 says that proposals must conserve and enhance the setting of designated heritage assets, including RPGs. So I'm pretty sure that our application contravenes that. So that's the first one we can use for our letter. I suppose that you could argue that by using local materials, paragraph, well, point 47.2 is complied with, so we probably wouldn't bother with that one. And 47.3, I really don't think that the application does respect the existing designed or natural landscape, so because it's barely mentioned there, so that's another one for our letter. But as far as I'm concerned, I think the best of these is probably 47.4, where I think you could safely say that it definitely does not comply with the requirement that the integrity of predominantly open and undeveloped character of the area, including the openness of views in and around the South Downs National Park, is not undermined. So straight away here, you've got three good local policies that you can quote in your letter to support your stance. Now, I'm afraid we've got another slightly bulky text page. There's quite a lot of good stuff in this local plan. If you continue to dig within policy 47, there is more that you can use. I've not mentioned all the local points by any means, the relevant points by any means, but here are a few that you could consider. I think I would be tempted to say that the proposals don't meet all three of these particularly, and I would expand in particular on how it fails to comply with D, the location, form, scale, massing and density landscape use and external appearance of developments within conservation areas should conserve and enhance the special historic interest. I think that's a real goodie for us to use. So at the risk of labouring the point, if you continue to go through the local plan with a tooth comb, you may well find more things that are helpful to support your opinion. I'm just going to have 2 more slides, promise. And the first one, which I think is probably worth referring to, deals with the environment, because I don't think that the development, in my opinion, safeguards and enhances the special qualities of the important heritage assets at Cowdray. So again, you would just say, you give the paragraph number. And finally, in the natural environment, but you can see, I think, why I think it is worth including, because certainly the proposals are going to have an adverse effect on the openness of the views as per these paragraphs. Now, unlike me, with a bit of luck, you will probably only need to look at planning applications within your local area. So it's probably helpful to you to download your local plan, or at least copy and paste those sections which refer to the heritage. And I keep them, anything like that, I would keep in my little file, sort of useful paragraphs. And I think you'd find that it will save you hours in the future of going through to find the details every time you need to refer to them. So time, I think, for another little breather. I certainly feel like this a lot of the time, and I'm sure that you do too. So the good news is that, of course, if you've fallen asleep or you're jolly nearly asleep now, this presentation is going to be available very soon on our resource hub. So you can probably just doze off completely now in the secure knowledge that you can just look it all up later. We're really coming towards the end now, and I've got just one more suggestion of useful things which you can quote when responding to planning applications. And this is one of my favourite bits. I really like this Historic England, the setting of heritage assets. It was published on the 2nd of December in 2017. And it's not a terribly long document, but there are lots of useful paragraphs in it that I use again and again. It's a bit of a mouthful to abbreviate in your planning letter. So if you name it in full the first time, then you can make up your own acronym and when you refer to it again later in the body of your letter. So let's start to look at a few of the useful paragraphs. So you can pop them in with a sentence along the lines of, I don't know, your officers will be aware of Historic England's good practice advice note on setting, which states on page 2, etc., etc. And then you can say, in our opinion, the applicant has failed to take note of this advice. And clearly, I think the second example I give here, because the site chosen for the proposed model farm is obviously, you can relate it to that second one. Now, there are lots more really terrific paragraphs in this relating to things like cumulative effect, which I've referred to in the past, even though it's not relevant in this instance, or if the heritage asset has already been compromised by unsympathetic development in the past. There's a good little thing about that too. And you can say that whether consideration needs to be given as to whether additional change will further detract from the significance. So it's just good to know that they're there. And another which kind of comes into this category, which isn't immediately relevant here, but which I use a lot, is that there doesn't need to be public access for significance to be affected. I've lost count of the amount of times when an applicant says, oh, well, it doesn't matter because there's no public access. It does matter. So there's a good little section in the Historic England Good Practice Advice, which you can say to just prove that particular point. So I'm going to leave you with just a couple more things that you might wish to bandy around for this application. Even though the development site is within the registered park and garden, it's definitely prominent and intrusive due to the topography. I think that for good measure, you could also say that the setting would be compromised by the model farm because it affects views from, across and through the registered park and garden, that it's going to change the landscape character, It's going to be visually dominant. There'd be lots of bustle and busyness and so forth. And this is all a lot of useful things to throw at the applicant. There are really quite a few more gems in the Historic England setting advice note. So I really urge you to download it and have it conveniently at hand to dip into when you require it. So we're really getting there. So we need to now sort of round everything up in a nice concluding paragraph. So I think that the points that we've already made, backed up with examples of where the application fails to comply with both national policy, the local plan, and Historic England's practice setting advice note, make a very strong case as to why this application should be refused. You just need to finish it off with something that rounds it all up. And I think that if you read that, what I've put on the screen, that something along those sort of lines probably are good. Now, when I've finished drafting a response, I always send it to the local county gardens trust for them to have a look at, because it's really helpful for them to look at it from their local perspective, because they'll say, actually, you know, you don't need to worry about that, that's fine, or you forgot completely about this, or even it's just as simple as I might have made some typos. Now, if you're doing it as an individual or sending it on behalf of your CGT, it's still worth just putting it past somebody else. And so I would liaise with your colleagues, definitely, for all the same reasons. And they will probably say, just, gosh, well done, thank you so much for doing that. And a second pair of eyes is always helpful. So all we have to do now is to send this response in. Now, oopsie. Mostly, Alison puts in the contact email address on the log. And usually with the case officer's name. But if you don't have that, it is possible to submit the comments straight from the website. You probably remember at the very beginning of the looking at the planning application talk, I showed you how to get onto the main planning page. So if you scroll down through that page, towards the bottom on the Chichester thing, there is a little tab which tells you how to submit a response online. And you eventually, if you follow those all through, you get to the bit where you can cut and paste your response that you've written and pop it onto the website. The slight drawback, as far as I'm concerned about that, is that often it has quite a short word limit. So I may want to write a bit more than that. And you also have to register and get a password and things. And short, I mean, I think Alison has the same password for every single local authority in the country. But she finds this really helpful if you want to do a no comment, because it's a very brief thing. So I like to try to always say, send it straight to the case officer. And if you can't find whatever the email address is, here you can see we've put it at the bottom of the slide, but sometimes that's not so easy. So you could always ask Alison or me, because we've got a list of all the generic planning emails for the whole country. I also mentioned that I like to try to send it direct to the case officer. And if you don't have that, sometimes it's worth having a stab at kind of working it out for yourself. If I'm really struggling to find the correct email address, I'll just go onto the main local authority website. And there's usually a section who says, these are your local councillors. It doesn't really matter which one you pick, but if you go onto that, you will see the way that they present their email addresses. It'll say, you know, fredblogs@chichester.gov.uk or f.blogs or whatever it is. And if you copy that using the case officer's name, if you copy that format, I find that 9 times out of 10, I strike lucky. So all you need to do is add the email addresses and press send, you're done. So congratulations. Now, that was quite a marathon. And I'd like to ask again, please, please don't forget to copy us into your response. And I'm sorry that it all had to go into a rather long and overwhelming session. But as I said before, this presentation is going to be available on our website, so you can have a catch up later. And I absolutely know that you're going to feel proud of the amazing letter that you've just written. And our casework log, once it's on there, it's an amazing resource, and it has the planning history of every single site we've ever been consulted on. And, you know, in 5 years' time, you may get another one, this particular site, maybe sooner. And it's terribly helpful to be able to look back to see what people said in the past. And the fact that it is this amazing resource is entirely down to the fact that we are so grateful for the amazing efforts of all the wonderful CGT volunteers who are busy all around the country writing responses or giving us local lowdown on applications. So I've said it before, and I'm going to say it again, but my job just would not be possible without all the wonderful help that you all give me. And we are so grateful for everything you do. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Margie, and congratulations. That was a marathon indeed, but very clearly presented. So in the break, we had a question, another one from Sally in Oxfordshire. She said, well done, Margie, lots covered. I'm just wondering whether statutory consultees have rights to access. If we can't have access, how can we assess applications? Is there something in the NPPF or Planning Act about this?
Well, I haven't seen anything. That doesn't mean to say that somewhere tucked away in some deep little paragraph somewhere, but I certainly am not aware of it. So we just have to ask nicely, and it's pretty rare that we are not allowed access, especially if you look through. Often we are put in touch with maybe the agent of whoever owns the site, and I don't think I've come across a case that we've ever not been allowed access in some way. I think one of the most private ones we did recently was Tottenham, which was bought by a very private and incredibly rich individual, and the whole thing was going to cost something like £50 million. So we were never allowed really to publicise photographs or anything, but we were allowed to go and make a site visit. And so I think that even if the most hyper private individuals allow you in, I think you probably should be able to get there.
Right, thank you. And Judith Al-Safar, who's from Warwickshire, has said, might you consider a training session on undesignated sites for us urban folk? I can see a need, so to prepare in advance would be great.
Well, I suppose that it's possible, but our remit as a statutory consultee is entirely with registered parks and gardens. And much as I would like to be able to respond to everything, I just don't have the capacity. As it is, we struggle to keep up with the stuff that we do get. Some CGTs are amazing, and occasionally we get something that is sufficiently of good quality that it might well be registered one day. And if that's the case, I probably would look into it and I probably would respond to it. And recently, Historic England have registered a whole lot, I think 20 odd new 20th century sites. And one of them in particular, it was registered after they had launched the planning application. So we were able to say, well, actually, look, since this planning application has been put in, this site has been designated. So you need to go back and think again about the documents because we need more information. And in fact, it's rumbling on and on. This one is called Stockley Park. And the proposals are likely to have quite a damaging effect because it was listed mostly because of the completeness of it. So it is a difficult one. I mean, of course, we would love to respond to absolutely everything, but bear in mind, I work 3 days a week. I cover the whole country. Alison, who I work with at the moment, works 2 days a week, and we just can't do it. So maybe there's someone out there who will do a wonderful thing on unregistered sites, but in the immediate future, it's probably unlikely to be me, I'm afraid.
It is something that we encourage CGTs to look at, to keep an eye on the non-designated sites, because as Margie said, they might well be the registered sites of the future. So we're always wanting your suggestions for future training. So I think that would be a sensible thing to look at. And also urban, doing responses for urban parks as well. So watch this space. We've got plenty more.
And also a lot of CGTs, they do research on many sites, and some of them aren't registered. And if they've put them on the local HER, or maybe there's a local list, that is some help towards, you know, when you're writing a planning thing. Yeah, it's very hard because there's just too much, and there's not enough of us there to battle for everything.
Thank you. Barbara Deason from London Gardens Trust says, is there a recommended length to your response letter?
Well, I kind of glaze over. I try to do it on one page if I can. If absolutely necessary, I make typeface smaller, but I sometimes go on to 2 pages. But by and large, I try very much to fit it onto one page. I try to be concise because, of course, the planning officer has got an awful lot of things that they need to read through, and they really don't need to look through an essay. So short and sweet, if possible.
Sounds sensible. Thank you. I think those were the last of the questions, and several comments from people saying thank you very much.
Well, I think it's me to say thank you to you. I can't believe you sat through that, but thank you.
That was our longest training webinar so far. So yes, congratulations everybody, and well done, Margie. So as Margie said, I'll email you shortly with a link to this recording so you can look through it again if you'd like to. And I'll also send you a short feedback form. It'd be really useful if you could just take a few minutes to fill that in, because we do use your feedback to plan our future events. I said in the chat box, we may want to use a couple of stills from this recording to pop on our social media. If anybody isn't happy for me to do that, if you could just drop me an email, and my email address is in the chat box, that would be great. Thank you. So our training webinars are free to attend. But as we're a small charity, we'd be extremely grateful if you would like to make a small donation or support us by joining us, and you can find the information on how to do that on our website. So our next couple of planning related webinars, so coming up next Monday, we'll have Helen Munger, who's Director of London Gardens Trust, and she'll be telling us about the long-running campaign to protect Victoria Tower Gardens from inappropriate development. And the week after, on the 14th, Victoria Thompson, who's Head of National Strategy at Historic England, will be looking at the potential impact of proposed changes to the planning system on historic design landscapes. And I know that's something that a lot of CGTs and others in the sector are quite concerned about. So if you visit our website, you can book onto those. So,
there's one more thing before you go. I've just seen that Carol Fitzgerald, because I've only just turned the chat box on because I'm not sufficiently organised to be able to talk and read what it says on the chat box. She says a collection of your go-to sayings would be useful. So it's not very smartly put together, but what I could do is I could email it to Tamsin and she could just send it out to everybody. So I'll do that when I get home in a bit.
That sounds great.
I'll do that. Thank you.
So I'd just like to say thank you all for joining us today. We do really appreciate your interest. If you feel like sending the recording link to anyone else who might be interested, any volunteers who aren't currently engaged in planning and you might like to sort of call them in, that would be great. So if you'd just like to unmute yourselves, I think Margie deserves a huge round of applause.
Thank you.